morning, everyone. I'm Tina Bahadori. I'm the Director for the National Center for Environmental Assessment at EPA and NCEA. And sitting next to me is Kristina Thayer, who is the Director of the IRIS Division in NCEA. Together, we're going to help set the stage today for the meeting. And most of my remarks at the beginning are really to provide the background for the study and what is it that we were hoping to get out of it. So most of the evidence and the discussion on content will happen starting with session 1. I also want to begin by thanking the academies and the members of the committee. It was difficult to pull this committee together in such a short time. Timing was very critical to us, so we are very grateful that the academies and the members of the committee were willing to do this. More as important as the evidence gathering exercise is the report that you will generate. It will be extremely informative in helping us set the path for the next generation of activities that we're trying to implement in the IRIS program, and very much looking forward to that report as well. And I also want to thank the members of the audience in the room, and I'm getting a lot of emails from people on the webinar as well, so thank you for that. So just as a little bit of background, and the reason I'm going through this is as much as I've been floating in the domain of risk assessment for many years, until I joined NCEA and I joined the IRIS program, I did not really appreciate and understand the complexity of its role, the importance of its role, and how that complexity feeds into its structure and its function and the necessity of its workflow. So for that, if you'll bear with me, I know most in this room are very familiar, but I'd like to go through it just a little bit. So in 1985, the IRIS program was created to foster consistency in the evaluation of chemical toxicity across the agency. Before that, each part of the agency would develop the toxicity values it needed for the risk context that was needed, but it created a significant amount of uncertainty in the stakeholder community and among the risk managers. So IRIS assessments by design contribute to decisions across EPA, but also across many of the other health agencies, both in the US and internationally as well. IRIS produces toxicity values, specifically toxicity reference values. For non-cancer, we produce reference doses as well as reference concentrations. And for cancer, we do the oral slope factors as well as the inhalation unit risks. It turns out that these are, in fact, quite critical for the risk management community. IRIS assessments also are not regulatory decisions. They have no direct bearing on the implementation of the regulations. What it does, they provide the science that informs that regulation. For that reason, the IRIS program is fully housed within the Office of Research and Development. The other thing that creates some confusion, especially in light of the recent passage of the very exciting recent passage of the Lautenberg Act, or Modernized TSCA Act, is sometimes it's misunderstood the breadth of statutes that the IRIS program provides a science for. So that includes the Clean Air Act amendments, the Clean Water Act, the Safe Drinking Water Act, Food Quality Protection Act, and all the Superfund-related acts, CERCLA and RCRA, as well as TSCA. A lot of our work provides broad input into a lot of agencies' goals related especially to children's health and environmental justice. So as such, we work very closely with both of those offices, which are housed within the Office of the Administrator. So why we're here today? So almost a year to the date, January 9th, 8th last year, Chris and I both joined NCEA. I came in I was the National Program Director for Chemical Safety for Sustainability Research, where a lot of the computational toxicology work is housed in EPA, and also as an exposure scientist, that was the background that I brought to NCEA. I also worked at the American Chemistry Council and EPRI, Electric Power Research Institute, for many years, so I brought that private sector background as well, and as my work as a management consultant. So the infusion, the combination of that background, I feel was very informative to my taking on this responsibility. And almost at the same time, Tom Burke had the foresight before leaving the agency, along with Bob Kavlock, to recruit Chris Thayer from NIHS, from the National Toxicology Program, really for this specific goal to come to the agency and really enable us to implement systematic review. We had been going very, very far in our NCEA and IRIS activities in implementing systematic review, but we had come to the realization that it was not an easy task to do, and that it was putting us at risk of further delays if we didn't really operationalize it up front really quickly. So we were able to persuade Chris to come and help us stand up a systematic review operation that is really first class, that is really functional, and we'll show you examples of how within this last year we have really operationalized this into all our work. So we came about a year ago, and part of the goal of recruiting us was to really put into high gear the implementation of the various committees that you all alluded to, and also to work with the senior leadership in the organization to really make IRIS as successful as we believe it can really be. So we came to NCEA and the IRIS program, and almost immediately were confronted with a myriad of reports, two of which you spoke about earlier, the formaldehyde report and the follow-up 2014 report, and then our colleagues at the Government Accountability Office and the work that they have done to assess the robustness of the IRIS program, as well as other chemical assessment activities in the agency, and our responsibility really to help the agency do chemical management more effectively. So we know we're familiar with the information in those first two reports, but with GAO, especially over the last year, we've been working very closely to really understand the nuances of their recommendations, and really, as we implement the recommendations of NRC, to also work with GAO to really functionally improve our operations and workflow, and to reduce the vulnerability that we create for the agency when we can't function and we can't produce our work products in the way that the agency needs us. So while you have provided us with a very significant challenge, I have to say that we have learned a lot from these reports and from working closely with many of you as we have moved to implement these recommendations. On top of that, of course, and especially being in Washington, Chris spends half her time in North Carolina, so she has partial immunity. But being in Washington, there is a constant cacophony of the beleaguered IRIS program, the dysfunctional IRIS program, all the things that apparently we can't do well, even though we are the gold standard of risk assessment by all accounts. And it was really difficult for us to really separate the issues and try to figure out what that balance, what that titration has to be between things that are truly fixable and should be fixed, and things that are by nature inherent to the complexity of the work that we do, and that aspiring to a popularity contest was probably, even for the extroverted Gemini in me, not really achievable. So we wanted to sort of separate those two things, identify the issues that are truly in need of being fixed, and make sure that in the shortest amount of time we address them, so that we could, together with the risk assessment community, with our community of stakeholders, with the people who love us, with the people who hate us, work on finding that common ground, because we do believe that this work is really, really critical, and the option of walking away from it does not exist. There's also no other program that can do the work that we do really better than we do, if I can say so myself. I don't need to really reiterate the findings of the last report, but just to point out a few things that sometimes gets lost in that cacophony, that the report in 2014 identified that overall the committee finds substantial improvements in the IRIS program. This is well before I got there. That in 2011, the committee recognized that its suggested changes to the IRIS program would take time to implement. We all agreed that the field of risk assessment is at a significant turning point. Certainly the passing of the Lautenberg Act highlighted that if we are going to put our money where our mouth is, if we are going to provide the safety information, the hazard information, exposure information around the large number of chemicals that are in commerce, it's going to take a community collaboration to really reach that successful level. And while IRIS plays a significant role in that, it's a job that's going to include this engagement from the community, and that it was going to take time. It also indicated that the EPA has not only responded to the recommendations made in the NRC formaldehyde report, but it is well on its way to meeting the general systematic review standards. And I look forward over the next 2 days to show you how far even beyond this recommendation we've gone. And that we've moved forward steadily in planning for and implementing changes in each element of the assessment process. And again, we look forward to showing you this evidence. And that the committee commends EPA for its substantive new approaches, and that the revisions will transform the IRIS program. So I'm going through this very systematically because with these changes and with the many changes that the ANSIA and IRIS leadership under Dr. Ken Olden and Dr. Vince Cogliano made before we got there, and the changes that we've made with our team, many of whom you'll meet over the next 2 days, even with all of those changes, even with as successful as we might be there, it's not going to make a trichloroethylene assessment more popular. It won't make formaldehyde assessment any easier to process, and it's not going to make reduce the likelihood that we will be and expect to be continually challenged about the quality and the effectiveness and the science of our assessment. It is for this reason that we have worked with our stakeholders, with the community, to create a process around IRIS that is hugely burdensome. It is incredibly difficult to implement, but it's also incredibly important. So that in the assessment process, we have added a significant portion that includes public engagement in the agency review among the other federal agencies, many of whom are collaborators, many of whom are users and customers of our assessments, and through the very, very intense public comment period and the rigorous peer review. While those processes add a significant burden and workload to the IRIS program, we believe that that's also the reason why the program has received the gold standard that it has. So before we got here, the ANSIA and IRIS had implemented in a phased approach many of the recommendations from both reports. Some examples here, you've heard this from Vince Cogliano before, that we have revised the structure, really the architecture of our assessments to enhance the clarity and transparency of presentation. Our assessments traditionally were multi-authored, they were multidisciplinary, and the product was often reams of prose on the order of 1,000+ pages. We've made significant improvement using a lot of visualization tools to really organize information, and we're moving more and more towards using digitalization and other tools that will make our assessments more accessible and much more easy to evaluate. We have gone through the process of implementing the assessments that I think Dr. Ken Olden negotiated in 2013. We've developed an updated process for developing and reviewing those assessments. Internally, we've significantly increased our public engagement, and that public engagement has been extremely productive, and it's allowed us to upfront identify, assess issues of significant controversy, and find ways to mitigate those better and earlier. We've established a specific subcommittee of the Science Advisory Board known as the Chemical Assessment Advisory Committee, and this committee has been basically well-versed in the IRIS process and has helped us put our assessments through that rigorous peer review. We've peer-reviewed about 5 IRIS assessments in that time period, and we have restructured the program, which I'll describe it in a minute. But I also want to say that those assessments, each one from 1 to that, so we didn't stop doing our work. As we've made these improvements, we have tried to continue to be productive, and with each assessment, we've upped the ante, we've further implemented the NRC recommendations, each more than the other. And the formaldehyde assessment, which we are hoping to bring to the Academy, as we were instructed to do by Congress, hopefully within the year, it will be sort of a really good example of how we have really addressed and taken to heart the recommendations of the committee. And we look forward to giving you that document as an indication of that progress. So one of the findings of the reports was this importance of our demonstrably improving our quality management workflow. So we did this at the many layers of the assessment process. We completely revamped our assessment development and review process by incorporating quality management into systematic review. The formalization of systematic review methodology has really forced this quality management. So for example, we use independent screeners when we do our screen studies, and we work a lot on conflict resolution to make sure that we have upfront addressed a lot of these issues, even in our assessment development process. We have a very rigorous review process that I just alluded to, that again adds to the burden of our productivity, but really adds significantly to the quality. We've developed scientific support teams across NCEA, mainly staffed by our own scientists, but we reach out across ORD and build this out. We have put together a systematic review work group, which is where a lot of not only our methods development happens, but that group also stays with our assessment workflow and are also the internal sounding board and reviewers of the implementation of systematic review in individual assessments. So there's this constant learning, new methods come in, we test them in the assessment, it goes back to the SR work group to evaluate whether we've really done it correctly or not. We've also added many other sort of support functions, really trying to operationalize systematic review. So we have a group that does the screening study evaluation, the data extraction group, use of specialized software to really, which you'll hear about a lot, and then a lot of train the trainer mode. And we do this in our community constantly and across the agency through a community of practice that we've also put up. We've also stood up a number of discipline-specific work groups that are being led by senior scientists in our organization. We have an epidemiology disciplinary work group, a PPPK, a stats, a neurotox, for example. And these work groups, again, very, very assessment focused. They reach into ORD and they constantly bring all the new research, all the new science, all the exciting new science that's going on in ORD in the area of thyroid, in the neurodevelopment area broadly, in endocrine disruption. All of that is being constantly fed in real time into our assessment activities. And we're very, very fortunate to have this community to fall back on. And then we've really made sure that across the NCEA structure, there's a team of executives really shepherding the assessment and really sit through, not just Chris and me, but the other colleagues, senior colleagues across the organization, really shepherding the document from inception to completion and really making sure that it meets this quality standard. We've also been one of your feedback to us to be very clear about roles and responsibilities and to make sure that those roles and responsibilities are carried forward in the assessment process, and we have done that. And somewhat unfortunate but somewhat fortuitous is because of the circumstances of the budget, we've had to pull back on our reliance on external contracting support, which means that we have redoubled on the earlier bullets I've told you. The trainer is now really on hyperdrive now, and we are really, everybody's rolled up their sleeves, regardless of level of seniority and experience, and is really there is a quantum cloud around Chris, the systematic review cloud, and the systematic review disciplinary work group, and we're all sucked into that cloud. We've all rolled up our sleeves. We're learning as we go, and we're implementing as we go, and I cannot tell you how exciting and energetic the system has been. So if what doesn't kill us will make us stronger for sure. And then a significant investment in the training. The other area that continuously comes up, especially in our engagement with GAO, is demonstrable ability to manage this complexity through this gorgeous interdisciplinary structure that I just described. And we realized that really one of our sort of wobbly points there was the ability to project and program manage. So, for example, in much as we tried, from even when Ken was here, to recruit epidemiologists, we've had a significant attrition in our epidemiology expertise and in NCA, and we've gone out and we've recruited some more. Hopefully we can make that happen. But this reliance on some of this critical capabilities, neurodevelopment, means that across individual assessments and between these complex assessments, we have to be able to manage these resources very, very carefully. So we've put a team together. The deputy for NCA, who's not in the room today, Mary Ross, and James Avery and Vicky Soto and Danesh Shams, all of whom you'll meet over the next 2 days, have really taken this project and program management to heart and have really implemented, and they're training the staff to really incorporate this into the decision process. So for example, when the administrator just last week signaled the intense focus on evaluation of the perfluorinated compounds, of course, NCA is going to play a big role in that, and we put a team together, and we have Samantha Jones and Jason Lambert in the room that are going to really implement this intense, crazy timeline for evaluation of PFAS. But that immediately was going to suck some resources out of a number of other high-profile assessments, and it was really particularly critical that we use this tool to really manage this. It sounds trivial, but it has significantly improved our ability to predict timelines, expect functional timeframes for our work, and to be able to report on that to our stakeholders. So it's in a very, very near term, we'll be posting these new timelines so that the stakeholder community can have a sense of what we're working on. For those of you who are not familiar with the GAO high-risk report, you'll know that the IRIS program has been on that report, along with the function of chemical evaluation in EPA, so beyond IRIS, what is done in the other programs as well. And really the main reason we were on this list, one is the sort of the project and research management side of it, of course, but much more importantly is they needed to see a senior level, executive level commitment to making this function in the agency successful. So we've been working very hard. Apparently they just don't take our word for it. We have to provide evidence of success, evidence of productivity, and evidence of engagement. So in the past year especially, we've gone into high gear and working very closely with the GAO to demonstrate this, especially now that the Lautenberg Act has been promulgated and has significantly increased our challenge. But in 2017, they did indicate that they definitely see that with the leadership commitment, the monitoring investment is definitely there, and we've met those standards very well. And in the other three areas, that includes the development of the action plan, completing our work products, and maintaining capacity. We're not there yet, but we're really working hard to arrive at that. And I provided in the earlier slide the link to that report if you're interested in looking at it. The other thing that we did since the 2014 report, we did a broad survey across the agency with our regional and program offices and identified, of course, not to anyone's surprise, what the highest priority of chemical assessments would be. So the list here is just the sort of the most prominent list that we're using to prioritize our resources. There's another 20 or so legacy chemicals that we were working on assessment that sort of goes along with this package and exists, and then it maintains the sphere of chemicals that we were assessing. But when Chris and I came to the agency and we looked at what resources were available to us and understanding what that resource direction was going to look like, it became evident that it would be next to impossible to meet the promise of this agenda. So while it's a transparent agenda, it reflects the needs of the agency. The way we were structured, there would be no way. So already just trying to get formaldehyde out of NCEA was proving to be a significant challenge. So adding these other assessments would be then an impossibility. So what do we do? Because clearly these are very important priorities for the agencies, for the states, and for the other federal partners. And that's what we're going to describe to you how we sort of started tackling. So the first step was that we started reaffirming with our partners, what is it you actually need? Do you really need every pathway, every eventuality of exposure, every form of that substance, every attribute of the population accounted for? Or can we prioritize and take on what we're calling a portfolio approach? Now, for those of you who've been in the risk assessment community, you know that compartmentalization is not our forte. It's not very easy to tell the risk assessors, please prioritize your absolute highest need, and let's start with that, and then we'll get to the other elements. But to the credit of the agency risk managers, they've worked with us over the past year to develop this portfolio approach so that our assessments are going to move away from a one-size-fits-all, so formaldehyde as a one-size-fits-all assessment. We're very proud of that assessment, but moving forward, we're going to peel it into smaller sizes, components of assessment, release those as they become ready, and then continue to work on other parts or on other chemicals as they become important. And how we prioritize that, where we focus our energy, will be one attribute of how we're using systematic review to prioritize functional productivity as well. We will be using this portfolio approach. We've invited our colleagues who have, for example, in Cincinnati, been leading the efforts in incorporating a lot of the new science for computational science in our assessments. We're engaged with them, engaged with NIHS and the National Toxicology Program, the Tox 21, to bring in that new science. And the portfolio approach allows us to define what are some of the data poor areas, even within an otherwise data-rich assessment, that might benefit from that mechanistic information, that might benefit from the new science. And in that portfolio approach, take a fit-for-purpose approach to increase our productivity. And we believe that we are able to meet the needs of the agency in a much more effective way. Dave Dorman alluded to one of our favorite reports, the systematic review report that was focused on endocrine disruption. We worked very hard because with a non-monotonic dose response report that was the antecedent to this study, the main result from it was if you're going to evaluate something like the low dose effect, you need to really implement systematic review. So we went back to the academy and we said, we understand your advice, but we don't really know how to do a systematic review extensively across all our assessments without adding another 3 or 4 years to our workflow. So this committee it was one of, I would say, the most pragmatic reports that the Academy has produced, and very helpful to us to identify the pitfalls and the vulnerabilities that could be created if you are verbatim and not pragmatic about systematic review. So what you will hear over the next 2 days is how we took this advice, this finding to heart, and really tried to address them using the technology, the software, the disciplinary work groups. And I hope that we can show you and show that committee, show Dave Dorman, that we learned from you and we've come up with a pragmatic approach to make systematic review very, very functional in NCO. I talked a little bit about our collaborations with NIHS, with the National Center for Computational Toxicology, and the work that we're doing in implementing the new approach methods. There's a poster on that tonight that you'll see, and there'll be more discussion of this tomorrow during session 4. We've also taken away a little bit of our haughtiness, I would say, the attitude that if it wasn't built in the IRIS program, it didn't count. So we have built broad collaborations with the other federal agencies, with the other health agencies and the state EPA, state environmental protection agencies. And for many of our assessments, we're going to create efficiencies where appropriate to start with an existing assessment and build on that using systematic review to meet the broader needs of the agency. So you'll hear a little bit about that as well. And then using the memorandum of understanding with the academic communities, especially internationally and in the US, to bring in master's students, for example, on training opportunities in NCEA, use their help to move some of the assessment, especially the groundwork of the assessment forward, but also use that as a training opportunity. So bring the fresh blood in and export some of the practice of risk assessment to the academic side as well. So in summary, if I had to tell you what you're going to hear from us over the next 2 days, is you're going to see that we have really increased the transparency of our work through this full commitment to implementing systematic review. We have adopted approaches that foster consistency across the program. All the active and new starts, we've not gone back and redone our assessments, but anything that was at a point that we could still deconvolute the assessment, we've done it. We've deconvoluted it, and we've implemented these principles in it, and you'll hear about some of those. We've modernized the IRIS program by bringing in a lot of the automation tools that we hope to shock and awe you with tonight. And we've modularized our product lines, as I explained, using the portfolio approach. And we have taken, Ken Olden had implemented a significant public engagement strategy. We've even taken that to even an earlier part of the problem formulation phase, and you'll hear that in our assessment plans and the protocols that we've developed. And we're using that engagement sort of in this continuous engagement process to improve the quality of our products. And we've also revitalized our engagement with the other federal agencies, using them as a sounding board, using them as a resource to really improve our workflow. So you will see that at the end of each segment of our presentation, we have a table like this where we have tried to summarize the evidence that we think, or the points that we've made with regard to the recommendations. We focus primarily on the table in Chapter 8 of the 2014 report that did a really nice job of sort of the must-do recommendations. So in this way, we're hoping to help the committee keep together who said what and how, so when you do your very fast production of the report, you know where to go for this information. So I really focus mostly on the quality management, on the review process, on the project and program management, on the engagement opportunities, but I also talked to you about how the new science and the portfolio approach has already transformed our workflow in the matter of the year. And a lot of that really started when Tom Burke and Bob Kavlock were still in the agency. You may have seen a number of publications spearheaded by both of them to really talking about how the way we were going risk assessments, especially at EPA, were no longer serving the public health community because we had basically grown into a state of paralysis. So these changes are intended to really make us useful to the public health community and to the stakeholder community that needs to know how to make decisions and make progress on their own activities as well. So I think that's my last slide, so I'll pause here. And I did not even look at time, so how are we doing on time? Okay, we're good to have some discussion. Okay.
Okay, great.
John always worries about me on time, so.
Never. So thank you, and we are running about half hour ahead. We have 45 minutes in the schedule for discussion with the committee on this general overview and discussion of the process, and we'll see where we are with time. We would then follow with a half hour of public comments, and if we're still running ahead, which we should be, we would then, I think, move on to the session one afternoon and get started. And we knew you were going to.
Yeah, and that was somewhat intentional because the other sessions are very content rich, and we wanted to make sure that you had time.
Okay, no, fair enough. So let me ask the committee, those of you who do have questions, do your thing with the cards. And Tina and Chris, it might be helpful if you could give us some understanding of the human resources available. And it sounds like there's sort of three groups, those who are IRIS programs, those within NCEA, and then it sounds like you reach beyond. And maybe a further comment on what sounds like a diminished role of external contractors.
So it is, even in the prior administration in general, there was the trend was towards the declining what we call extramural resources. This administrator in particular is very keen on efficiency, and that applies more broadly to the agency as a whole, but especially in support functions in the parts of the organizations like ORD that are for whom the role is really to support the implementation of the rule of law. So with that, definitely the signal is the trend is towards higher efficiency, declining extramural resources, and declining FTE. So that's the reality. On top of it, in NCEA, we have a significant number of very, very experienced risk assessors who, even without these external challenges, were reaching the point of considering retirement. Right around the winter holidays, we had a significant attrition in our population among some of our most senior and most experienced. And there's another trend, unfortunately, before us. And believe me, I have shackled and imprisoned them, but they're still going. So that's the reality. So what we have done is really barrel down, and actually it would be better for me to let Chris explain, because it is really her program that's particularly impacted, to see what methods she's really used to be able to augment these diminishing resources. So
I would say one of the first things that we did, starting probably, so we arrived in January, probably starting February, March, we knew this was going to be the trend, was immediately to try to train our staff to do the functions that had been previously done by contractors. And so that was sort of fortunate, because through that process, then they learned systematic review. And so it was really, so when we have teams, we might have teams of people who are epidemiologists or animal toxicologists, but they're participating in screening studies and data extraction. So they're getting hands-on experience with some of the tools that we'll show you today. So I would say that would be the first thing. Make sure our staff are trained to do these functions that in some cases, in many cases, contractors had previously done. And then I would think that, again, sort of the project management focuses, in particular, we often have chronic bottlenecks with epidemiology expertise, with pharmacokinetic expertise. And so really trying to sort of be vigilant about sort of how do we signal when we're sort of fully committed to an assessment. And that means, can we adequately resource it to bring it to fruition? And so that's been an ongoing challenge, because sort of the stability of our workforce has been in flux. In addition to some of the changes that Tina indicated, we've had some staff on details to TSCA, sort of in some cases multiple details. So it makes it hard for us to sort of anticipate, even 6 months down the line, who we're going to have available to work on what. And so we've been trying to sort of really think about implementing the portfolio, because we know that we need to sort of demonstrate productivity, to try to have a balanced portfolio so that not everything that we're working on is a formaldehyde. To have some things that we can be sort of fairly simplistic to keep the flow in there. We've also really been, we've had some MOUs with ATSDR, with NIOSH. We've implemented with NTP. We use those MOUs to try to sort of find other disciplinary experts and see if they can give us feedback. We've also been implementing MOUs with a number of academic universities, in particular University of Washington and Michigan, have brand new graduate programs where they want their students to have hands-on experience in doing this kind of assessment work. So we think there we have an opportunity where we can bring them into an IRIS assessment team, mentor them, show you how they apply systematic review principles to assessments, and then it's a win-win. So we're thinking about ways that we can sort of really engage the federal family, engage states, engage the academic community to help give us a little bit of bandwidth. And again, in a way that we hope is a win-win.
And we've sort of added to that, John, is on some level, the extramural resources was part of the challenge of the bounding exercise around assessment. So not having that has been useful for the portfolio. So if we absolutely don't have the expertise, even in our broader circle, to get a piece of an assessment done, it's just made more sense to cordon it off and define the assessment within the realm of the expertise that we can garner around agency or this outreach. So it's been a forcing function to discipline scope definition for us, and also it's also reduced us constant dynamics that we have about which experts we import from outside to help us with things.
Thanks, that's helpful. I mean, if Chris, if I said specifically today, how many FTEs are in the IRIS program? Is that an answerable question?
65 in the program, 30 in the division. So 30 people on the IRIS book, 65 involved in the program. But if you actually ask today, John, you will know that all 180 some people who work at NCEA are fully committed to making the IRIS program successful. You will be surprised that our ecologists who have jumped in and engaged in our systematic review process, helping with a lot of things. You will see the ISA team, the Integrated Science Assessment, that's led by John Vandenberg. We've reached into their epidemiologists. We've reached into their PK capabilities. Everyone is right now engaged in making the IRIS program successful. And we're very, very excited about that energy.
Thanks. Dave?
Thank you. A couple of things for clarification. With respect to the quality management program, can you speak a little bit more about the processes you've put in place with respect to executive oversight? Just trying to understand what steps are actually used to assess the assessments and to look at an evergreen approach. So that's one first family of questions. And then my second question is, I'm confused still about the portfolio approach and how the portfolio approach, say, fits into problem formulation or scoping. So if you could speak to that a little bit as well. So, and then I'll probably bug you more during the course of the day, but we'll start there.
So let me start with executive oversight, because that's really something Tom Burke and Bob Cavlock especially started when Ken was still here, is first within NCEA, personally, Chris Thayer, we have Dave Boussard in the room, one of our other division directors. I can't see him right now. Yeah, right there. John Vandenberg, as well as Annette Gatchett in Cincinnati, and the branch chiefs particularly. So every assessment has an executive sort of shepherd, patron for it. Moving forward, we're also adding such a patron from the program and region office to also stay with us through the process to make sure that we don't drift off on meeting the needs. This team continuously is informed of and briefed of the progress of it. There's a management council that's formed. It's called the Iris Management Council. And around that management council, there are regular meetings. I think they're weekly with the brand chiefs, and then monthly with the full management council, so that includes me. We sit in the room and we anticipate and address issues, whether they're resource or scientific issues. And so one of the things that I have personally feel like we've been able to do through that engagement is use our network across ANSIA. And that's how, John, we've been able to reach into the rest of ORD and bring those capabilities in through these activities of this management council. So somebody will say, for example, it was on the HBCD assessment, we ran into some complex evaluation of the thyroid issues, but I knew from my CSS program, Chemical Safety for Sustainability, that we had made a significant investment in understanding the role of the thyroid, and that those publications were just coming to fruition, so it was natural that maybe ANSIA would not know about them. So we held a summit with that thyroid team and brought that expertise through the executive team into that assessment, and then future assessments that involve the thyroid, for example. So that's how and it's a continuous flow of the assessment team, their executive shepherd, and this team through the management council and through the review functions to work together. We've also reached out to executives from especially HHS to serve with us as reviewers of our interim assessment products as well. And that's been extremely helpful. People like John Bucher or Mike DeVito especially have been very involved with the interim reviews. So it's not enough to wait to the end. When we wait to the end, it's usually too late, but this sort of interim engagement through the interdisciplinary work groups has allowed us to address issues much earlier. Is it perfect yet? Not yet, probably because we're still doing too many things. Next Thursday, we're going to have a priority setting meeting. Vicky Soto, you can pick her brain during one of the breaks, is we're going to do this priority setting exercise, because even with this executive engagement, when there are too many live assessments, something's going to fall through the crack. So we're going to have to do a little bit more of that tightening of the belt and reducing, just coming out and saying, we cannot do everything on this list in 2018. So by pulling some of those resources back, binging, focusing more on getting individual assessments done with more executive oversight, we think is the way to go. So that's in fact what we're implementing right now. As I said, we have a big priority setting internal to NCA meeting next Thursday, and hopefully that will be very helpful. So that was that question. And on the second question, Dave, was...
The second question related to clarification about the portfolio approach,
yes,
and specifically how it fits into, say, the scoping,
right,
problem formulation.
So do you want to actually describe that a little? And there'll be some examples specific.
And actually, I would say what I described, some of these processes are also other features of how we're sort of trying to ensure the quality and clarity of the documents. So one of the first things that we do is when a chemical is on our list is we try to understand what is the specific need by sort of reaching out to that officer program and really having sort of discussions. Do you need a reference concentration? Do you need a reference dose? What kind of analysis is needed? And in some cases, you'll find out that maybe both weren't needed, right? Maybe they just need one of those. And then right again, that sort of tells us, okay, then maybe in this particular case, if what's desired is a reference concentration, maybe the oral studies are not as important. So that's one example where you can sort of take, we don't have to do everything under the sun, the need is this. And if we have an abundance of inhalation studies for a reference concentration, then maybe the oral studies are more supportive in the context of a systematic review. So that would be sort of, so it's embedded. We try to have this active engagement, what's needed. We try to do some sort of analysis to try to understand the extent and nature of the evidence. Is there an abundance of what's directly needed? Or do we have to think about sort of the need for extrapolating across routes of administration, so the need for pharmacokinetic modeling, which is sort of more a different complexity. So it's embedded. But we're trying to sort of make sure that the assessments most squarely address the need. And then I would say through that process, we use some of the documentations that I'll be discussing. One is going to be an assessment plan that outlines what is the question, and what is the kind of evidence that we think is most pertinent to address that question. And through that document that is shared with the agency, initially with the part of the agency that really needs it, and then more broadly, the clarity. You get a lot of comments about the clarity of those documents. So I would say, and then having the disciplinary work groups review those documents and the protocols, it's embedded sort of the quality and clarity of the material.
So we come at it really from two ends. So one is the other critical hire in the past year is actually behind John, Dr. Emma Lavoie, who came from the Safer Choice program in the Office of Toxics. And her role has been a lot of this sitting with the program and regional offices and the risk managers and beginning to define what is the risk context that they're trying to address so that we can use that to more pragmatically define the scope of that particular assessment. So a chemical may have multiple components for an assessment because it may have multiple clients, but we will try to define it in a way so that we don't wait for everything to be done before we release an assessment on a chemical, but that we can complete pieces of that portfolio and define it. So that's the functional part of it. That's how it works. And then it's informed by the systematic review. So where, for example, there's preponderance of human evidence, and if the human evidence is more than enough to get us to the reference doses that we're interested in, is it really necessary to look? And sometimes it is, and sometimes it isn't, and that's where the systematic review has been very helpful to us.
Thank you.
Can I just add one more question about the quality? So in addition is that we have sort of these disciplinary work groups to give us feedback on the quality of documents. We also have an internal review committee. So when somebody has a draft assessment and they think we're actually ready to share it within the agency, then it goes through this sort of internal peer review where we often have reviewers from within the program but also outside the program and sometime across agencies to give us sort of that quality control check before we kick it up the chain.
One quick question on follow-up to Dave's question. So it sounds like the portfolio approach involves a set of principles, some pragmatic decision-making, some scoping of the literature. Is there a piece of paper that says, here's the portfolio approach, here's the principles, here's how we make decisions?
Well, we actually tried to write that up when Tom Burke was here, because he was sort of one of the people who helped define the space for us. Because as you know, the risk assessment community is not amenable to change very easily. But the paper as a sort of a theoretical thing was difficult to process because unless we showed it in action, it was difficult. So you will see over the next 2 days, you will see that, for example, we were fortunate to be able to bring before you the uranium. We brought up for you an assessment plan and a protocol for the two, for uranium and for chloroform, to show you how we use the portfolio approach to narrowly define the scope and what principles we use to define that scope. You will also see, and that's also posted on the website, how we use systematic review to evaluate an existing chloroprene assessment in response to a request for correction. So these are elements of that portfolio that through demonstration we're going to show you. Tonight, you'll see posters on our phthalate assessment. We did an evaluation early this year, and we realized no agency program was interested or in need of an actual assessment of any of the phthalates we were working on. So a portfolio response there was to put the science through literature publications out there, through the peer-reviewed domain, so that it could be used by other agencies and other interested parties. So what we have for you is a demonstration, and there's a preamble to that that's posted page authored by Chris that sort of describes how we're doing that portfolio. So it's called the memo from the IRIS director. So it's one page basically on the website as well.
Okay, thanks. And I think maybe the right time to return to this will be tomorrow as we close out and see if there are lingering questions then about what the portfolio approach is. George.